And we're back. This is episode 499 of the Colombia Calling podcast. Our very special guests this week are none other than Director of Colombia Risk Analysis, Sergio Guzmán, and the Analysis Coordinator for Colombia Risk Analysis, Daniel Poveda. And it's a great pleasure to have them both on this, the final episode of 2023. And we're going to look at a new report they've got out, which is incredibly timely, as they should be, and very interesting. It's entitled Understanding China's Tech Footprint in Colombia, Challenges and Opportunities. But we're also going to look back at the year in politics in Colombia and maybe a couple of predictions for the year ahead, 2024. But first, Daniel, Sergio, welcome on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Richard, thank you so much for having me on again. It's a pleasure to be back, and I celebrate with you 499 episodes, almost 500. I'm very excited about the potential surprise you have for us in episode 500.
It's huge, and I don't know what to do yet for episode 500. So anybody listening, if you've got contacts with someone amazing, please send them in, because I really need, obviously we need a landmark interviewee or guest, best have said. But Daniel, this is your first time on the podcast, and you are going to be taking the reins to begin with, I think, about this report on China, Colombia. And just as one quick question, this is a follow-on from the report earlier in the year about sort of China's influence in Colombia and so on, that Sergio, myself, and who was it? It was
Sara Torres.
Sara Torres, that's it, who's gone to Oxford, I think, since then.
Correct.
Amazing. Look at that academic footprint you have, Sergio. But so anyway, Sara Torres, and then that's right. So tell us, Daniel, tell us about this report.
All right. Thank you, Richard. It is my first time on your podcast. I do hope it isn't the last time, though. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. Our last report on this subject was called Local Perceptions of Chinese Investment in Colombia. You guys can all download it and read it. It's on our website. And what we found out there is that there's still much to be known about the relationship between Colombia and China. And what we saw is that there is a very special relationship with Chinese tech investment in the country. So what we sought out to do was kind of do a little bit more research on the subject and see what's happening on those, what one could say are initially commercial ties, but we saw a very interesting political factor there. And as you know, Richard, and as we saw in the news recently, Colombia and China now consider themselves strategic partners. So I mean, this report comes at a really great time where we can see that we're becoming closer trade partners and also strengthening our political ties. So the report comes at the best time where we can see how Chinese technology, cutting edge Chinese technology, is making an impact in different sectors here in Colombia, such as mobility, transportation, renewable energy, infrastructure, healthcare, security. They have this digital and technological footprint here in the country. And this report is out here to understand how this works and how this investment is present in Colombia.
Mm-hmm. So we talk about this, as you say, it's a relationship and it's a strategic partnership. But how does this differ from where Colombia was before in the relationship with China?
So it's great that you mention it, Richard, because we do believe that kind of like having elevated these bilateral relations don't really mark much of a change in the relationship between the two countries. So what we think is that this announcement of a strategic partnership was actually kind of a step short or a step shy of actually announcing that Colombia was going to sign on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So what we think is that the current government was kind of timid and hesitant to actually sign on to the initiative and not actually become closer partners. So that hesitation is also very interesting because there were many rumors the weeks before President Gustavo Petro's visit to China, where we thought that he was going to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative, but that didn't happen. So we think that's very interesting. We do think that, I mean, this sudden change in the relationship does mean that we're becoming closer partners. However, it does also signal that Colombia isn't prepared and isn't ready to take that next step with China. So that's very interesting.
In terms of our neighbors in the region, who else is signed up? I mean, who is signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative? Because Colombia obviously is a strategic partner in, well, South America for the US. And, Gustavo Petro, while he has many, many faults, would understand that that partnership needs to be protected, that with the US, but at the same time, kind of play both off against one another for the benefit of the country itself. So who in the region have signed up for the Belt and Road?
Well, many countries in the region. Actually, Colombia, it would be one of the last to sign on if we ever did so. Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, very recently, if I'm not wrong, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay. So what we do see is that we're kind of lagging in this aspect. And I'm glad that you mentioned the whole United States factor, because we do believe that that is very important whenever the country is going to take the decision to actually adhere to the Belt and Road Initiative. We do think that even though Colombia is sending these signals of having a closer and growing relationship with China, we do believe that since the United States continues to be Colombia's closest ally in the region, well, we do think that this kind of does have an impact and this hesitancy that we see in being able to sign on. So that's very interesting. We do think that there's some kind of loyalty to the United States, and that Colombia hasn't actually figured out that we don't really have to choose anymore. And we see that our neighbors in the region are not choosing between the United States and China, and do have important relationships, or at least trade relations, with both countries. However, Colombia, being its closest ally in the region, or at least I do believe it to be so as still, well, we do see that that might play as a factor, not being having a closer friendship with China at the time.
I mean, it's a curious one. It's a curious one as we go into 2024 and what could happen. Let's say that Donald Trump gets the Republican nomination, and therefore, an incredibly high probability. Again, we're predicting, let's say he wins the next election. And of course, a lot of his ranting and raving up on stage is about China. This, you would think, could benefit Colombia by not being, in the Belt and Road. But then, of course, the Trump presidency was kind of known for having no real foreign policy objective. So I don't know. I mean, Colombia, you'd think, well, I don't know. This plan sounds strategic. This plan sounds like President Petro had it organized, but it doesn't feel long term. It doesn't feel like, well, nothing in politics feels particularly long term, because you've only got the 4 years. But it doesn't feel long term. What do you think on this basis then?
All right, Richard. Well, on the first point of Donald Trump possibly being being elected president next year, we do believe that even though Colombia will continue to be a close ally of the United States, whether it be a Democrat or a Republican in the White House from 2025, we do believe that a Trump administration could make the relationship a bit rocky and difficult to navigate. Right now, we have noticed that the Petro administration is interested in having a special relationship and continuing to have a special relationship with the United States. Most of his domestic policies and ambitions and goals need the support of the United States, such as total peace and whatnot. And I'm glad that you mentioned that this kind of approachment to China doesn't seem long-term, because definitely what we saw in the report is that these decisions that we're making in technology or with Chinese tech are indeed long-term.
Oh, good.
So it's very interesting. So it's very interesting because even though we don't seem to have this kind of strategic relationship or approachment to China, we are definitely taking decisions that are going to be long term with this Chinese tech investment. So as we can see in the 5G tender that's about to happen on the 20th of December, we're going to see who are those great winners of kind of like the spectrum, the 5G spectrum. Because I know we're late to the party to get 5G here. And what we can see is that these big operators here, telecommunications operators here in Colombia, most of them use Chinese equipment and technology for their networks. So what we're seeing is that Colombia doesn't really have kind of like this, isn't really thinking this through of this commitment to China on the long term.
Now, you said that there is an increase of, let's say, Chinese influence or interest in politics. I need you to tell us all about this.
All right. So in the report, what we can see is obviously China, and from kind of like this joint statement that they issued with Gustavo Petro, they say that even though we didn't sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative, they do say that we're welcome to do so in the future. So the doors are open to actually adhere to the Belt and Road Initiative in the future. We're not sure if that's going to happen during the current administration, though. And here in Colombia, what we do see is they do have an interest in closening ties with us, and we do see that the technology sector is one of those sectors where they have where there's a great Chinese presence. And what we do find out is that we don't really see these investments through a political lens here. From China's point of view, well, we know that they're here for the long term, and they know that these investments are long term. And I mean, having a great participation in the 5G network will be very difficult to kind of replace or change in the future. And we see that this happening in other sectors of the market. We can see this happening in mobility, where most of, or if I'm not wrong, all of the electric fleet of buses are Chinese. So what we do see is that they do have this kind of interest of being a close, at least commercial partner. And this tech investment seems to be very revealing of how they want to kind of close in on Colombia. And we see this repeated in different sectors. The report obviously has much more details, but it's interesting how this happens in the security sector, even though we have a very close relationship to the United States in that regard, how that's happening in the health sector. Recently, we saw the announcement of having a vaccine production factory that's going to be open here in Bogota. So we do see that how with all of these technological investments, or at least technological in nature, they are closing in Colombia and having, well, they do see us in the long term, at least. So what we can see is that China's kind of setting up the scene for in the future, if Colombia has a rocky relationship with its closest allies, well, we can always count on China as a plan B. That's what I see, at least.
Oh, okay. When we maybe this is the moment for Sergio to jump in, but when we look at, let's say, international diplomacy, international relations, what's going on right now? And I see that, you know, Colombia is obviously ideally positioned and very carefully positioned, having reopened a diplomatic political relationship with neighboring Venezuela, and Colombia has been the conduit for the US to negotiate with Venezuela, hence the lifting of sanctions and so on. Looking at what's going on now, Venezuela, and of course the aggressions, spoken aggressions at this moment towards the Essequibo nation, they're part of Guyana next door. Surely there has to be an influence as well from let's say Chinese government diplomacy. They're very involved in Venezuela. We're, there has to be a connection. It really is all a big chess game here. Sergio, I'm sorry to drop you in that one.
No, this is my bread and butter. I think one of the problems with Colombia's foreign policy is that it doesn't necessarily reflect the long-term interests of the Colombian state, but mirrors the domestic political interests of the administration in office. And that's exactly what Gustavo Petro has shown time and time again. He went to China the week before the local elections to try to get an announcement to underground Bogota's first metro line.
Yeah,
that was the objective of the trip. And he walked away of the first meeting with the Chinese construction company saying that he himself, like the state, would finance 100% the undergrounding of the metro. To me, that suggests obviously the people in China told him no. And also they didn't tell him no because they don't like Petro or they don't like his objectives. They told him no in part also because if China agrees to finance the undergrounding of Bogota's first metro line without consequences, without penalties, how many other countries are going to be in a line out the door trying to renegotiate contractual terms with Chinese firms that are doing their job? And this, of course, shows that Petro is only thinking about himself in this dynamic geopolitical relation. He doesn't understand the global chessboard, as you put it very well. And to that extent, I think when we translate that to other conflicts like Essequibo, Petro is looking at it to how is this going to affect total peace? How is this going to affect, not how is this going to affect Colombia's standing geopolitically? Is this coherent with what I've said about, for instance, Palestine, where he is, up in arms about a big aggressor state against a smaller state, which is mirror the situation in Guyana. He's obviously calling for peace conferences and talks and dialogues, but look at what's happening in Ukraine also. He is also not taking a side in that conflict, but he does choose to side with the Palestinians on their conflict. And I don't want to weigh in on the merits of each case, but it definitely shows that Petro doesn't manage foreign policy in a coherent way that takes into account the fundamental interests of the Colombian state, but instead look at his whims, look at his caprichos, look at his sort of way of understanding politics and his internal turmoil with his previous experiences, and projects them instead of saying what is the Colombian government's underlying best interests. And this is not a defense of the previous administration or the administration before that. This is more like a reprimand against the Colombian foreign ministry and the relationship between the foreign ministry and the executive branch and the presidency. Because I think right now the foreign ministry is completely subdued to the whims of the executive, of the president, of the chief executive office of the country, and not really looking at long-term interests in Colombia. And I think a large part has to do with the fact that the people that we put as ambassadors or as consuls abroad are not the most qualified people that go through civil service training. Some of them certainly are, and I'm sure some of them who listen to this are going to point out the exceptions. But I would remind you they are exceptions, and so we need to professionalize our diplomatic service, and we need to make sure our foreign office is independent, but also is one that looks at the state's best interest. Problem with that is every president that comes into office promises a version of that I just mentioned, and then quickly after they take power, they recognize it's a very, very important tool for internal political tradesmanship to achieve congressional and legislative objectives. So with that, I'll just jump off my soapbox, but say this is part of the problem.
So, I mean, basically, I mean, I think there's a direct arrow pointing at the newly installed Roy Barreras in London. I saw
Yes,
photos
and look,
today.
you know what they say is Roy Barreras could come and take the Ministry of Defense, right?
Yeah.
Which would be a complete slap in the face to His Majesty the King, to whom Roy Barreras just last week, with a lot of pomp and flair, presented his diplomatic credentials to. So how does it look that Colombia has these diplomats who present credentials and all of a sudden they get summoned back to the country to serve in office? I mean, you know, who's going to last more as ambassador, Roy Barreras or a lettuce, right?
It's a tough one. But I mean, I just think, well, if we go back and we go back and we go back, that so much of all of this geopolitical posturing and of course the games taking place behind closed doors and you know, dark alleyways, I would think, of the diplomatic circles. I want to bring Guyana up again because of course the oil found, and it's Exxon, you know, and Exxon is obviously of a different section of the world, and China very heavily invested into Venezuela, and Venezuela in some dire straits at the moment. Colombia could be, you know, is so well positioned to be an international broker at this moment, and I just don't see the current government doing that. Or am I not seeing something that everyone else sees? I don't know. Maybe
well,
Daniel,
my view,
I don't
and
know.
my view, and maybe Daniel can complement this, is Maduro, this is all about internal politics for
Yes.
Maduro as well. This is about throwing off the candidacy of Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary, not making a commitment to honest and open and fair elections in 2024, and drumming up some foreign mess, just like in Argentina in Malvinas in '86, trying to create this disarray abroad to consolidate power domestically. Having said that, you know, there's a lot of questions about what happened in 1899.
Yeah.
And Colombians should know because that's how we lost Panama. But I also don't see Petro or any other presidency trying to reclaim Panama, for instance.
Yeah.
That right now would seem ridiculous to a lot of people. But obviously, to the majority of Venezuelans, it doesn't seem ridiculous. It does seem that it's, you know, a long-term aspiration of the government. They've had it in their map for quite a while. But the thing is, you know, sure, the Petro administration is well positioned to sort of navigate this, but it doesn't come out as an impartial arbiter because of its own domestic priorities. I don't know, Daniel, what do you think?
You know, definitely, Colombia should be this kind of broker or mediator with anything that has to do or anything that's related with the Venezuelan political crisis. They are the neighboring country. It's important to do so. And we saw that the Petro administration was very interested in being that mediator and actually having that role in order to kind of bring back this democratic transition in Venezuela. And we saw Colombia trying to partner up with the United States to be able to do so. And that's kind of how we got this roadmap to these future Venezuelan presidential elections and whatnot. But what we saw, what we've been seeing recently is this these Colombian efforts have kind of been losing momentum, and the United States has kind of gone their own way in approaching Venezuela. And Petro, for some reason, because we saw all of this this energy to actually play this role, has kind of lost sight of being that broker or mediator in the Venezuelan political crisis. So what we see is, and here I'm kind of giving you a sneak peek into what we're trying to do for next year. And one of those big political risks that we identify is the Venezuelan political crisis and how Colombia is going to respond to these potential presidential elections during the second semester of 2024 in Venezuela. So we see though that as one of those major political risks for the current administration is their stance on the Venezuelan electoral integrity, because we see that this roadmap that had been built to be able to bring back the opposition in Venezuela to participate in politics and this kind of democratic transition in the country, we see that they're actually not really following through with it. So that's going to be one of those big questions to deal with next year.
That's a really good one, and I hadn't thought of it. I should have thought of it, of course, but I would just imagine that Gustavo Petro will take to Twitter and say something perhaps not so astute, and then sort of publicly declare that he believes in the I don't know, the democratic popularity of the Venezuelan people or something like that. Something so blatantly nebulous that he'll only get further in trouble here at home and then be praised by Venezuela, which in itself is receiving a poisoned chalice internationally. So it's going to be a tough one for that. If we talk China. We've talked about China a lot. We've talked about China, of course, in the investment in the underground, the metro system here. That company is also involved in the highway up through Urabá as well. Is it Czech? Is it called Czech? The company, I think. And you've talked about other investments and so on. But let's go to, as we've got sort of another 10, 15 minutes here. But let's look at a little bit about. Well, how has the year gone politically in Colombia when we look at this? I mean, investments, if we're looking at total peace, I have to shift it a little bit because it is the end of the year, and I know that some people will want a bit of a summary of these things. Sergio, how are you feeling at the end of 2023?
Exhausted.
Well, we all are. You're a new dad.
yeah. No, I mean that's part of it, but also, I think another big part of it is this government creates a lot of news. Yes. So it requires us to always sort of like stay on top of it and always like look at the minutia and look at the inside baseball that's become increasingly important. I would summarize this year in sort of like three sort of big topics. And the first has to do with the economy, that it settled down after a big ruckus over Petro. His mandate or what he came into government sort of proposing has not been as easy to implement as he would have it. So that has sort of made markets, particularly bonds investors and people in Wall Street, calm down a little bit about the anxiety there was about Gustavo Petro initially. On the second front, I would say, politically speaking, how Petro has squandered his coalition government. He still has some of it, but he's basically broken up his coalition with all the cabinet shuffles. There's been I'll jump into each of these specifically in a minute. I just want to get my thoughts organized. And then I would also talk about how Petro is losing power after the local elections that happened in October and what that means for the future. Okay. We can talk about security and total peace, and we're not very optimistic about that because that's how the year started, if you remember. At 10:45 p.m. on December 31st, 2022, Petro tweeted famously, "We reached a 6-month ceasefire with the ELN and with the Gulf Plan and with these other 6 cartels," and all these people were like, "Wow." He actually achieved it. And less than 48 hours later, the ELN was actually not quite, right? So I think Petro's peace programs and peace policies have hit a wall, both because of who he's negotiating with, the ELN, the FARC dissidences, etc. These are not necessarily the most politically savvy of organizations, and they also don't bear in mind the best interest for the country. No. And they also don't realize that this is their best chance, perhaps their only chance, of negotiating in good faith with a government that wants to be generous. That suggests that in the future, future governments will not share the same generosity, and they should take advantage of that opportunity. But it seems as though they're taking advantage of that opportunity by trying to extract as many concessions as they can from the government, some of which are completely unpalatable to public opinion. For instance, the ELN insists on maintaining kidnapping as a way to finance their activities. Famously, they kidnapped Luis Diaz's father, Mane Diaz, and that didn't go well with public opinion. But the ELN says, these things are justified. These things are fair game under our ceasefire agreement. And I think, a lot of people call bullshit on that one, and so do I.
Yeah.
But what we've seen is that the government's insistence on a total peace and on a ceasefire that is broad and that has tangible benefits for local communities living in rural areas has translated into a greater territorial control by armed actors and organized armed groups in those territories. So instead of strengthening the state, it seems as though there's an active debilitation of state capacity at the local level, which is in turn strengthening the agency of these organized armed groups, making it even more difficult and peace more elusive in Colombia as a result. Having said that, and jumping onto the politics side, President Petro started off the year with a cabinet that many of us were surprised maintained their positions, and that only lasted until mid-February when he sacked Minister Alejandro Gaviria, who had been health minister under Santos and was brought in as education minister under Petro. And after he sacked Gaviria in February, he sacked 7 other ministers in early April, and he said the coalition government is no longer, sent a big FU to the different political parties. And he said, I'm going to take away your jobs unless you pass my reforms. And instead of, putting in more moderates or people who were known to be technocrats to get things done, he put in loyalists in his cabinet. And that further cemented the idea that Petro is not going to moderate his aspirations to pass legislation in Congress. He's not going to moderate his statements. He's not going to moderate his tweets because basically, and this was a running joke, the adults in the room left. And he's now left with the applause group, the people who can only applaud what Petro does or says. And that is also, of course, harmful. And then on May 27th, and this is a date that I remember well because it's my child's birthday, a Laura Sarabia scandal erupted. And that day, we had Nannygate, where Laura Sarabia was, allegedly found to have conducted a very strong search of one of her nannies because she allegedly stole money. But then the nanny came on television and said, Laura Sarabia had huge piles of cash and that she traveled frequently to Venezuela on a charter flight to see Armando Benedetti on multiple occasions. And then Armando Benedetti came out and started revealing things about the government, about alleged finance violations in the campaign, etc. So this quickly became a little nightmare for the government that it surprisingly, left off pretty unscathed because Laura Sarabia is back in government. And although Benedetti's out of government, he's still not revealing very private information about the campaign. And so that at least has been contained for now. And I think that those revelations can become very intricate later on because they also slashed the president's son, Nicolas Petro, who had allegedly partaken in this web of influencing, of financial influences that he's already admitted to the Fiscalia. So we still need to see how this plays out as the trial proceeds and as more evidence and more witnesses reach agreements with the government, with the Fiscalia, who's also going to change. So that's to pack that in. The political side is a little complicated for the president. in terms of the economy, and as I was mentioning at first, there was all this frenzy about, oh my God, Petro is a far left-wing radical who is going to, expropriate and do all this damage to the economy. And I think a lot of people made decisions based on fear. And there were some who stayed because they were saying, look, Petro doesn't have, like, the government and the executive branch is powerful, but it's not all power. It can't make these broad changes to the functioning of the economy. The central bank is still independent. The courts are still independent. The legislature is still independent, and they're not going to, bend over backwards for the president. And I think when people took that view in mind, they were thinking, well, it's gonna be bad, but how much damage can he do? It was a question that I received frequently. And of course, the president did try to do some damage and still tries to do some damage with holding or withholding financing to the healthcare sector, with issuing emergency decrees in La Guajira to try to get more state financing to that department, to try to make his reforms through executive action, to try to push through some of the reforms, including the education reform, the pension reform, and the labor reform, which would be quite negative for the business sector, perhaps not the education reform. But then also the president has been trying to continue his policy of climate martyrdom. And let me explain that a little bit, what I mean. Colombia emits only 0.5% of CO2 gases. But President Petro has made a decisive choice not to have new exploration or production contracts for oil, gas, and coal, which, by the way, are close to 80% of Colombia's export basket. So while he's doing that, he's also damaging long-term, and this is key, not short-term investment, but long-term investment into these areas, which have continued to be the most important areas for Colombia's overall economy. And this has caused, Ecopetrol stocks to go down. This has also caused the stocks of many of the oil companies that operate in Colombia to go down and have them explore opportunities elsewhere in other countries, like, for instance, Guyana, right? And so the issue here is, yes, Colombia's economy has withstood a big impact. The dollar started at 4,900 a year, and now it closes right under 4,000. So the Petro administration is giving itself, chest bumps about stability. But at the same time, we have a contraction of consumption. We have high inflation. We have a high interest rate from the central bank. And we also have a government that's very willing to engage in deficit growing policies, such as reducing the price of the SOAT, which is the insurance policy for cars and motorcycles, to incentivize people to buy it, but people just don't buy it. He's also tried to raise taxes on, or raise prices of fuel, which is a good policy, by the way, but at the same time, this is going to push inflation upwards. And he's also tried to give record increases in the minimum wage, which again push inflation upwards. So how can he then ask the central bank to reduce interest rates that are meant to control inflation, while at the same time some of his policies directly incentivize inflation to increase? So that's going to be a big conundrum, as the year closes and as next year begins on the economy. And then finally, and I'm sorry for taking all this time, finally, there's a local elections bill, which the government lost handily on October 29th. And we can do a full episode about this, and I think we've already looked into it quite a bit in this podcast before. But clearly, the voters didn't support or didn't endorse the current administration in its outlook. Instead, they went for known quantities, opponents. They also went for people who had previous experience in local administration and traditional parties. And so in that way, this idea that the government had a mandate, or has a mandate for broad change, now has an asterisk because these local mayors and administrators also have a mandate. And the mandate is opposite to the one given to President Petro. So how those two things balance out is going to be a topic that we'll continue to look into as 2024 hits. And all of this analysis that we do is possible because we have people who subscribe to our newsletter. We have people who reach out to us and ask for consultations because we're able to think about the country's long-term perspectives. So for all you listeners out there, institutional or otherwise, you are more than welcome to help us grow and help us write these fabulous reports that we do.
No small self-promotion there from Sergio, but we're very well deserved. Colombia Risk Analysis actually enjoyed their 5th anniversary this year, a huge deal. I was honored to be invited, and this bum of a journalist vagabond was there rubbing shoulders with diplomats and people of industry. But it was quite the event, and congratulations to Colombia Risk Analysis on their 5-year anniversary. That was a very, very big summary of what has happened and what will likely happen. And I don't know if we can add very much to that because, I mean, Daniel, has there been something that Sergio missed? I doubt it, but, feel free.
I think Sergio actually mentioned most of it. I would just add that I do believe that there's still hope for Petro's total peace plans. We're going to see this year's going to be very challenging for the government. We have a new person now steering the wheel on Petro's peace policies that was recently announced, which is Odi Patiño. The government actually has to they have to think through how they're going to overcome the foot dragging in Congress in order to pass major reforms. So that's going to be another big challenge for the government next year. And also there's kind of like this big question mark in what's going to be the future of these institutional clashes or crisis with the new attorney general, which is also going to be selected during, I would believe, early next year. So that would be kind of like the way we see some efforts from the current government with this so-called national agreement to be able to kind of build up political capital and be able to pass these very ambitious reforms and plans for the country. But as I said at the beginning, I do believe, as it was mentioned by Sergio, it's going to be another very challenging year for the Gustavo Petro administration.
As Sergio said, it's exhausting because this government creates so much news. And I went off and worked. Well, I was working offshore for a month and disconnected myself from the continual slew of the Colombian news cycle, and it was a cathartic break. It really was. It really was. I could actually stop being quite so parochial, I think, about Colombian news and just sort of looking at international news a bit more. It's like, oh, it felt good, but we all work on this, so we all have to suck it up and understand what's going on. But thank you. Listen, I think this is a great episode. I think we've really covered a lot of ground, and especially not least your report on China's investments in Colombia and so on. I think that's very important. I think people should definitely read it. You can find it, I guess, on the website. Is it up there? It's Understanding China's Tech Footprint in Colombia, Challenges and Opportunities. It's from December 2023, so hot off the press. Just go to colombiariskanalysis.com, right? colombiariskanalysis.com. Of course, it's all over Twitter and Facebook and everywhere else as well. You can find Colombia Risk. But yes, get in touch with them. Get in touch because, it's a small team. The email will likely go to the boss. And if you are a student out there, international relations, politics, so on, irrelevant of where you are based, get in touch with them. They're always looking for some people to get involved, hands-on experience, help writing these documents, etc. I've seen a lot of people go through those doors. A lot of people are moving on to, well, obviously they're not moving on to greater things. They're moving across, let's say. They're not moving on to greater things. But that, I mean, it is. How many people do you have now working for you, Sergio?
So we have a staff of 10,
10.
and that doesn't include, yes, and that doesn't include the people who come for short stints as volunteers or interns. And again, many of these documents are written with their effort, and they have a direct influence in how these documents are written, where they go, and we of course will push this forward for many of them. And so, in a way, if you are a graduate student and you don't know what you're doing over the summer, reach out to us. Find us on LinkedIn. Find us on Twitter, social media, etc. Let us know that you're interested, and perhaps we can find something to do. If university has a capstone or funding to bring you, and a lot of universities do. Again, we can work something out. But we would love to use your talent to continue building on our stellar reputation so far.
A stellar reputation indeed. Let me take this moment to say thank you again to Sergio Guzmán, the Director of Colombia Risk Analysis, Daniel Poveda, the Analysis Coordinator at Colombia Risk as well. It has been a fascinating and, as always, enlightening chat. There is hope. I mean, Daniel came in with positive aspects there at the end to give us a lift. It's the end of the year. We are all exhausted. It really is. And I don't think next year will be any less exhausting. I think that's the truth of it. I think that's what we'll take from it all. But it has been a great conversation with you all. Let's do this to say, well, Merry Christmas to those who celebrate and a Happy New Year to everyone. And thank you, Sergio and Daniel.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah to everybody who's listening.
Thank you, Richard. Happy holidays. Hope to be back on the podcast soon.
You will be. Colombia Risk is on here about 3 or 4 times a year, so you'll be back on before we know it. So, and all of you, the listeners out there, thank you so much for your continued support, your continued listenership throughout this year. We're almost at 500 episodes. The first episode next year will be episode 500. Emily and myself are looking for a star performer to come on as a guest. So please, any ideas, any people that you can think of, any connections that you have, we are all ears. But that is us signing off for 2023. Thank you again. And, well, until 2024. Bye-bye.